from France and one group from Germany.
Travel for education. This is the role of the PTPI family member. Travel for education.
Who have been hurt by our ancestors. How do we deal
the
with
role
that? And of course,
of PTPI family member. I am happy to be one of the family member. Mấy anh chị Việt Nam nên theo dõi cái video này để hiểu rằng cái nền giáo dục và cái ngoại giao của cái hiện tại ở tại Mỹ là như thế.
So my novel in this case very specifically is trying to take the most innocent kid you can imagine, who everybody can identify, most Americans can identify, and saying, here comes this captive, somebody who was taken across a border against his will, like slaves have, right, and so others have. Or like Viet himself, he didn't want to come here necessarily, he was just brought here, right? And force us to look into what that life means, and also ask how we can forgive ourselves and forgive the past. Because I don't think that it's a question always of revenge and of anger.
Nhân ngày 30 tháng 4, cho nên tôi phổ biến tài liệu này để chia sẻ cùng quý thế hệ trẻ ở Việt Nam.
And wars in their countries right now, which the United States has sponsored.
That's Ariel Dorfman, who knows what U.S. intervention and invasions mean, having been forced out of Chile as a result of the CIA-backed coup, the Nixon-backed, Kissinger-backed coup that took out the president of Chile in 1973. Ariel Dorfman was cultural advisor to the Chilean president Salvador Allende, who went down and died in the palace in Santiago, September 11, 1973, on the first day of that coup. Viet, your book, The Displaced Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, your previous books, remarkable. There's so many quotes from your books. You write, to become a refugee is to know inevitably that the past is not only marked by the passage of time, but by loss. The loss of loved ones, of countries, of identities, of selves. We want to give voice to all those losses that would otherwise remain unheard except by us and those near and dear to us. And in a previous book, in your book, Nothing Ever
Đây là
Dies,
một người trẻ Việt Nam đã viết về chiến tranh Việt Nam. Rất mừng. Cháu nó không nói được tiếng Việt rành, nhưng mà nó hiểu được chiến tranh Việt Nam.
These people had lost everything. They'd lost relatives, property, careers, identities, selves. They felt that they'd lost their country. And I grew up surrounded by people who were constantly telling stories filled with anger and sadness and rage and bitterness and melancholy. But for most Americans, when they heard the Vietnamese refugees speak, all the Vietnamese refugees ever said in English was, "Thank you for saving us." And I know that there are Vietnamese refugees who will say in private, the United States betrayed us, but they won't say that in public in English. And so this is the environment that I grew up in, and I was also someone who was watching all these American movies of the Vietnam War, because I was an American boy. And it was clear in these movies that the Hollywood was fighting America's wars all over again. So the war wasn't over for Americans either, and I've gone around this country speaking to many kinds of American audiences and met many Americans of the generation of the war, whether they were soldiers or anti-war protesters or just people observing on TV. And for many of these people, the war remains a defining moment of their generation, and for them, the war hasn't ended either. So a lot of my work is not just about the Vietnam War, but about situating the Vietnam War in a much longer history of warfare, whether it's from the Vietnamese perspective or from the American perspective, where I see the Vietnam War as just being an episode in a long history of American intervention overseas. Philippines, Korea, Japan, China, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Iraq and Afghanistan, and the rest of what's happening in the Middle East are really extensions of these policies.
You talk about immigrants being more reassuring than refugees, and you say Refugees are the zombies of the world, the undead who rise from dying states to march or swim toward our borders in endless waves. An estimated 60 million such stateless people exist, 1 in every 122 people alive today. If they formed their own country, it would be the world's 24th largest, bigger than South Africa, Spain, Iraq, or Canada.
Bigger than France, too, to put it in another perspective. And I call them the zombies of the world because I think many people don't think of refugees as human. And they're not really oftentimes depicted as human in media reports. Again, we just see images of refugees suffering on boats, dying, and so on. And of course, it's important to show these kinds of images in order to elicit pity and sympathy and maybe try to change policy, but it also reinforces this idea that refugees are somehow less than us, when in reality refugees are people who are just like us until these calamitous situations displace them. And Americans, I think in particular, have a hard time imagining empathy for refugees because we just can't imagine that we might be a country that produces refugees, except we have Puerto Rico. Except we have Hurricane Katrina. But we isolate those and we forget about those and we don't think of those issues, those people as being refugees.
You wrote an eloquent piece right after Donald Trump was elected president that went viral. Talk about your concerns at the time, well over a year ago, and what you feel now.
Well, I think that for many people like me, we were stunned and shocked and in a state of crisis as we try to figure out what this election of Donald Trump meant. And it was at one time a call for mobilization and resistance, but for me it was also a time to think about what it is that the Trump presidency represents. And for me, it's impossible to think about that without thinking about President Obama. Many people, Americans, are stunned by President Trump and asking, how can this happen? Well, it's not a surprise. Trump represents American instincts that have been with us since the founding of this country. This is a country founded on slavery and on genocide. That's a part of the American character. It's a part of American history. Many of us would want to deny it or forget it. And President Trump brings this to the foreground because he's basically the president of a new emergent kind of white identity politics that's always been with us, except it never called itself white. It simply called itself American. Right. But President Obama has a role to play in this because these are the two facets of the American character. Obama an inclusion on the one hand, Trump an exclusion on the other. They've always been with us. Now the issue is that if we get wrapped up in a domestic discussion about Obama versus Trump, we forget that President Obama himself also tends to represent some of the worst instincts of the American character as overseas, in terms of the continuing exertion of American imperial power, and having a president that is as nice and as articulate and as intelligent as
Great,
Obama
good idea.
Change these kinds of American imperial
Great,
policies.
good idea.
Of course, at
Rất giỏi.
to his own shock, some of his closest immigrant rights allies ended up calling him the deporter-in-chief. He deported millions and millions and millions of immigrants to this country.
President Clinton, President Obama, despite their rhetoric and despite their praise of certain kinds of inclusionary attitudes towards refugees and immigrants and minorities and women and so on, yes, they were responsible for various kinds of policies that had negative impacts on minority populations and on immigrant and refugee populations. And those of us who consider ourselves to be progressives and on the side of greater social equality, greater inclusion, really have to hold everyone responsible regardless of their party affiliations.
Well, Ariel Dorfman, you also wrote a piece after Donald Trump was elected president. Now America, you know how Chileans felt. We're going to talk about that in a minute.